Good afternoon. This is Doris Baylor with the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's holiday. We are so excited to have some of his fraternity brothers here from Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. They're going to share with us a little bit about the history of the organization. It is the first African American fraternity. It is also distinguished in that Dr. Martin Luther King was a member. It is also distinguished in it was founded at a majority university. It is the only Pan-Atlantic organization that was founded at a campus other than a historical black college. I think it was the first, it led the way, and we're going to learn more about the organization, why it's so special, and what the current members are doing to honor the rich legacy as well as the work of Dr. Martin Luther King. I grew up in North Carolina. My parents were not able to vote without games being played when they went to the polls. It was either a literacy test, or it was some polling tax, or it was, we've lost your registration. The Civil Rights Movement changed all of that. The Voting Rights Amendment changed the game. People were no longer being discriminated against because of the color of their skin. As citizens of the United States, they were able to vote. We know today things are back in many instances in communities where people who have not voted are now being removed from the rosters. We also know that people who don't value voting will lose the right to vote. Today, Reverend Dr. Bernice King has said she is going to work on voters' suppression in honor of her father's life and work. I vote because I can. I vote because it matters. I vote because my parents remember a time when they could not. I was 10 years old when the Voting Rights Amendment was passed, and I take it very seriously. It is my right, my honor, my duty to be informed and vote. I want to share with you that I have Mr. Razan King and Mr. Mahad Omar here today, and they're going to share with us the work that they're doing with a voteless people is a hopeless people. We hope that after listening to these young men and their actions, that we're going to be all around a voting people. Razan, can you share a little bit with us about Alpha Phi Alpha?
I sure can. First, thank you very much for having us today. You did an incredible job with that. I don't even know what I could say. What I will say to the audience, though, is it's important that you text, call a 18 to 25-year-old right now, tell them to tune in, and just give us a couple minutes if they doubt voting. And hopefully at the end of our conversation today, they no longer doubt it. So my name is Razan King. I am a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Incorporated. As we like to say, it was founded on an ice cold Tuesday, December 4th, 1906, in Ithaca, New York, at Cornell University. We are the first, which is true, intercollegiate. That's the distinguishing factor of Alpha Phi Alpha. We're the first intercollegiate African American fraternal organization in the United States of America. And what's interesting about our founding is if you think about history, 1906 is not very far from when overall slavery ended in the United States. So think about that for a second. You have 7 black men, upstate New York, Ivy League University, telling the world that they were going to start a fraternal organization. And then, within 30 years of founding that fraternal organization, founded one of the most amazing movements in the country called A Voteless People is a Hopeless People. A little bit about Minnesota. I am a part of the Gamma Xi Lambda chapter, which was actually founded in 1946 in Minnesota. Think about that for a second. And then my brother here, Brother Mahad Omar, is a part of our Mu chapter, which is our undergrad chapter, which was founded in 1912. So you do the math and try to figure out how African Americans in upstate New York figured out how to get to Minnesota in 1912. So that's just a little backdrop history about who we are as an organization. NAACP was founded in 1909. Urban League was founded in 1910. And so it makes sense that within that 30 years, in the 1930s, we kicked off A Voteless People as a Hopeless People. And I'm going to let Brother Omar talk a little bit about what that was and why in the 1930s, and kind of walk you through that history a little bit.
For sure. All right, thank you, Brother Razan. So again, my name is Mahad Omar, brother of the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. So let's go all the way back to the 1930s. This was the exact decade where "Of all those people for a hopeless people" slogan was coined. So we got to think about it this way. So African Americans in the United States of America had the right to vote since the 15th Amendment was passed in the 1870s. So for at least 60 years, African Americans had the right to vote. But there was still a lot of structures, a lot of obstacles, both public and private structures that were instated to prevent African Americans from even getting to the poll stations in the first place. And the slogan "Of Oldest People for a Hopeless People" was coined in 1936 at Johnson C. Smith University, which happens to be our Alpha Omicron chapter of Alpha Alpha Fraternity. And that slogan and the program itself was dedicated to become one of the first national programs for Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. And this program, "Of Oldest People for Hopeless People," was responsible for bringing hundreds of African Americans the education that they needed to realize what kind of a powerful tool that voting was, how it enriched them, how suppression was there to make sure that they didn't have the power to protect themselves. And this representation was important for them. So as a result, hundreds and hundreds of African Americans were given this opportunity to get to the polls. And these obstacles aren't as just physical, such as literacy tests. These also included threats of violence by individuals that did not want to see African Americans head to the polling stations, as well as threats of reprisal. It also included poll taxes, and it includes gerrymandering, which is something that we see today, and a manipulation of voting borderlines by politicians. So there are multiple different forms of voter suppression that we can see today, and that program in 1930s was the first to kind of go against the grain of voter suppression by introducing voter education and voter representation.
Excellent.
Yes.
Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience,
Yes.
but where he stands at times of challenges and controversy." You gentlemen of Alpha Phi Alpha are standing strong now. You stood strong before. Can you share with me a little bit of your thoughts about this poem that Dr. King quoted in a speech? It's called "Give Us the Ballot." Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry about federal government. We will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of anti-lynching law. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and mercy. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17, 1954. I find it so fascinating that this speech is rarely referenced. We hear so many wonderful tributes to Dr. Martin Luther King, but rarely do we hear about Give Us the Ballot. And he makes reference to the decision of May 17th, 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. Can you share with us a little bit your perspective in hearing this?
Wow, that's very powerful, and you're right in alignment because we have some additional pieces to that piece you just read. So
Wonderful.
we're going to share that at the end. But it's interesting that that was actually given in 1957.
Yes.
And it was because him, as well as people have to remember, Martin Luther King was a very large figure, but there were hundreds of people that were behind and on the side of Martin Luther King. So when you think about the Sleeping Porter movement, right, and some of those individuals, see, when I moved here in 2015, and I voted in the 2016 presidential election, I actually was expecting some challenges. Here I am, a new guy from Detroit, Michigan. I hadn't had my Minnesota license just yet. I did have my card. However, I got to the polls, and I must admit, it was probably the easiest voting experience I had ever had in my whole life. Not to say that I had ever gotten challenged in Detroit, but let's talk about what happens in Detroit, which is a majority African American city. The voters in Detroit are told, be ready. Have all your appropriate identification when you go to the poll. You have no idea who will be there to challenge you for whatever reason that may be. And so it's interesting that we go to the polls so easily. There's no one hollering at us. There are no dogs there. There's nobody waiting for you when you come out. You just go. And so when I think about the words of Martin Luther King and the ease that we have things today, it took an older gentleman to help me understand what that meant, because I was once upon a time a little bit younger, a little less gray than I have now. And I remember thinking, some of this stuff, we're good. It's working out. I have my college degree and things of that nature. And he said, young man, he said, I need you to understand that this thing was always about equality. It was always about, we want to continue to have our businesses. We want to continue to have our neighborhoods. We want to continue to thrive and do well. It wasn't that we just wanted to just put everything together. And so I left that conversation really educated about, well, what it really, really, really was about. And when I think about where my grandmother lived, which was a side of Detroit called the North End, Google it one day. Google Black Bottom, Detroit. These are areas of town because my grandparents migrated from the South. Grandmother Louisianian and my grandfather Tennessean came up for work. So my grandfather worked in the steel industry. But the thing that I remember about that time, even as a little boy, the cleaners were African American owned, where we took our clothes to get dry cleaned. The place that I went to get my candy was owned by an African American man. And so my life, though I didn't really realize, was very rich. But if I took you to that neighborhood today, if we got on the plane today and we went to that same neighborhood, you would see blight. You would see that my grandmother's home is no longer there. You will see that candy store right around the corner is just boarded up. You would never know that it was a pride place of the neighborhood once upon a time. The dry cleaners is empty and the windows are broken out. And so again, we're at a point where we gotta wake up from the comfort and get back to really pushing this idea that our vote does matter, because, and I'll let Brother Omar comment, if voting didn't matter, then they wouldn't try so hard to bring back the boundaries. So if you have a circle this big for 100,000 people, and then the state comes and says, we're gonna shrink that boundary, and so you lose 20,000. but you still got 80,000 people. Then that 20,000 is going to be a part of another voting district. And that voting district could have been for a particular party that those particular people wanted. And so if it didn't matter, then they wouldn't do that. If it didn't matter when state of Florida said, fellas can vote, we're gonna, and it was in the hundreds of thousands in Florida, and those advocates went crazy. Well, the legislation comes back and says, well, wait a minute, fellas can vote, but you got to make sure all of your financial applications to the court are paid. So if you owe the court a $200 bill, you still can't vote. So if it didn't matter, then organizations and movements would not try so hard to keep people of color from voting. So, anything on that, Brother Omar?
Well said, Brother Razan. What I wanted to incorporate into this would be a quote that I heard from someone, which kind of like explains this really nicely. So when you choose to not vote, per se, when you're not voting, you're no longer at the table anymore. You're on the menu. You're going to be the one that's you're going to have policies, you're going to have structures, plans, ideas made on your behalf without your input. And once your input is included, you're going to be able to manipulate that menu. You're going to be able to manipulate the outcomes of whatever is decided at the table in the first place. And that's what I can see from Give Us the Ballot by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And that in an ideal world, if all people were given the ballot, without having to face any kind of obstacle preventing them from being able to get to the ballot in the first place, and with them having the proper education to know which representatives that they want to honestly vote for, and not something that they are doing off of a gut instinct, which can sometimes be helpful. With perfect information, without 0% obstacles, essentially, you are able to vote in the people that are going to do the right things on not just your behalf, but on the behalf of the community that you are a part of and behalf of your loved ones, which includes justice, which includes proper social programs for you and your loved ones, and it includes essentially a perfect world, or a perfect country, I should say, at least, and hopefully a perfect world. Because if there's 100% voting power for the voting age of 18 up, it can honestly affect the rest of the world for the good, for the best. That's what I see in regards to Give Us the Ballot's poem.
Yes.
Where if we are able to vote collectively for the benefit of humanity and for the benefit of mankind, there will only be benefits as a result. And there will only be good things to see. And it's sad to see that there are obstacles and there are public opinion swayers to kind of manipulate public opinion and understandings of what is going on the political field, which can prevent a lot of necessary change from happening.
You're right. As a matter of fact, that was one of the reasons I got involved with the League of Women Voters, because they present the information. It's a nonpartisan organization, and we share the information. We bring guests on to talk about current issues that are relevant to your life, and you hear what they represent, what their values are, and you make your own decision. And I think it's so important that as a voting member of our society, that you do the education, that you educate yourself on who will represent you best, or who has represented you best, and you make that decision. I tell you, you should not let anyone tell you how to vote.
That's right.
You should vote the way you're conscious and what you feel is important. I want to share with you a quote. It says, "In democracy, it is your vote that counts. Your opinion, your ideas, all of those come together when you make your vote. If you don't vote, I believe what you said is you're on the menu." That was pretty interesting. I want to share another quote. It says, "Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire." And this is by Yates, and I think your words sharing with our audience especially from your perspective, is very valuable. It lights a fire inside to say, I can make a difference. I can control what's happening in my country and my world and my community. Voting is one of the tools that I can use. I know Justice Thurgood Marshall was very close to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and I wondered is he a member of the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity as well?
Yes,
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 he
he is. And we're proud of him as well.
Would you
We're
like to
proud of him
elaborate?
from this perspective. If you go back to how long we've had the Supreme Court of the United States, we've only had 2 African American Supreme Court justices, and the very first one was Thurgood Marshall. And it's very powerful because if you haven't seen the movie, we encourage you to, go see the movie.
Which
You kn-
one?
I believe it's called just Thurgood, or it's called Marshall.
Marshall.
And, it gives you a little bit of detail around his particular time around the Brown versus the Board of Education case. But he has a very interesting past with the NAACP, a lot of work through the NAACP. People forget that, when I look at the NAACP, there are 2 really big things. There's the civil rights, but then, man, I'm going to say this word, they were cold with the legal. Because if you look at the civil rights movement, and even movements today, part of what I feel is missing, when I was an undergrad, I was 19 years old, and I went to a convention that was about organizing. And organizing is way beyond just getting people together and standing out. Organizing is actually a strategy. And part of that strategy is you have to know the law. Because if you know the law, then you know what you can do,
Yes.
and then you also know what you're able to dismantle.
Yes.
And that was the brilliance behind the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, and the attorneys that worked so hard to get those cases overturned. Another thing about that case, too, is that for those that may not have known, that case was not just about integration. Again, equal. We have good books, they have good books. We have a great school building, they have a great school building. They have a playground, we have a playground. So it was about equality, and that was the failure of the system. That's why Jim Crow failed, because again, separate but equal was not equal. It was separate, and there was a water fountain, but man, look at that water fountain, compared
Exactly.
to that water fountain. And so that whole system and again, if I go back to if you take the emotion out and you focus on the law, you'll get a lot further.
Absolutely, and so much of this was in the Constitution or the amendments thereafter,
That's
yet
correct.
it was totally dismissed. We hear so much about movies not being worth seeing, but you and I talked, and I remember
Yes.
Green Book. We
Yes.
talked about that being a great movie to
Absolutely.
see if you don't know what the country looked like back then.
That's right.
And also, Just Mercy has just come out, and it is heartbreaking, but real.
Yes.
And that's in our current time now.
Yes.
So there are many opportunities for people to learn more. I recall also talking with you about many of the books that Dr. King wrote.
Right.
And I think we got a count of 6 that he actually wrote. And then there are a plethora of those books about him. So the internet had at least 20 or more. And
Yes.
so I want to encourage our listeners
Yes,
to
please.
do their homework.
Please.
An educated person is an informed person.
Please.
And I know you tell us all the time, voteless people are hopeless people. And we need to do our work because to be great, we have to take responsibility.
That's right.
I want to thank you both for coming. Are there any closing call to action statements or words that you'd like to share? And certainly feel free to do so. Rosanna,
Yes.
you going to start?
Yes,
Okay.
there are 3 things that we wanted to leave with our audience today. One, it is the simplicity in voting activity. A lot of people think that, well, how do I encourage people to vote? Do I go out and have a 500-person rally? You could, and I encourage you to do that if that's what you want to do. But what you could do is simply just call a few friends and say, hey, this Friday, I'm having a little pizza party at my house. Come on by. And I just want to talk a little bit about what's on the national agenda. That's a really big move to make. And so it doesn't have to be a grandioso thing to get the word out about voting. The other thing that we wanted to encourage people around voting is holding politicians accountable. I think for us, that's a bigger part beyond just the voting, because a lot of movements are about going to vote.
Yes.
Yep, go and vote. And so going to vote, I kind of equate that to going to get educated and never go interview for a job. Your intention was to get a job, so you went and got educated, but you don't go, And so our thing about voting is hold the politicians accountable. Now, you could go to the White House and stand outside if you want. Yep, you can do that. Or how about this? You can just go to your local school board meeting. If there's something going on with the children of your neighborhood, and that school is not, and an example we'll use is in Minnesota, they talk about the education gap all the time.
Yes.
Well, we know that not all the school districts are equal in terms of resources and things. And so if I lived in a neighborhood where my school was not appropriately supported financially, I think I'm gonna go to the school board meeting. I wanna talk to the school board and say, I know that SAT, ACT prep is coming up. What are we doing to make sure that the kids at XYZ High School are supported? So again, doesn't have to be anything big. And then the last thing we want to leave you with is that we pulled information right off the website of the Secretary of State around felony voting. And so we want to encourage you to, if you do have a felony, that in the state of Minnesota, it says this, quote, you can vote after you finish all parts of your sentence, including probation, parole, or supervised release. So this myth that if I'm a felon, I can't vote is not that simple. So if you're a felon, I encourage you to go to the Secretary of State website and make sure that you know your rights. So those would be our 3 calls to action.
Yep. And essentially, Brother Razan said everything that was necessary to be said, especially within the state of Minnesota. But I do want to call back to a time, 2017, before I could actually vote, but being surrounded by plenty of individuals that could vote at the time. 2016, I should say. 2016, not 2017, during the presidential election. A lot of my friends were telling me that they didn't want to vote. And a lot of my friends, and not even just friends, but acquaintances also said that they didn't feel like go to the polls and vote because they felt like they couldn't get represented by the person that they wanted to represent them. And to which I thought was, you're essentially casting away the one political tool that you have, one of the most simple political tools, not necessarily simple in regards to how it works, but simple in regards to its ease of actually occurring. That has a major stake in regards to your entire life here in the United States of America. And the fact that if you do the research, and the fact that you can even pencil in the candidates that you want, and to show that you still want a specific candidate regardless of the odds, that is doing a lot more compared to not voting at all. And that you are casting your vote aside to let different parties duke it out, knowing that you're not going to get what you want, which is very unsatisfactory. You need to realize that literal blood, sweat, and tears have been spilled over the right to vote for all people, all diversity, all kinds of backgrounds. You need to realize that this is not a privilege, this is a right. You have the right to vote now. Don't throw that right away. You need to make sure that you're utilizing that to the max. And that's not just in national elections, like let's say for the president, but also local elections within your respective state, within your respective districts, and then when your respective cities, and all the way down to, let's say, a school board level. You need to realize that you have the power to vote in the people that are not just people that you can hear on the news per se, but people that are within your own community that teach your kids, that that write your bills, that has a major stake in regards to how much you can get paid. There is plenty to think about in regards to your right to vote. And it is simple as going onto a website with a laptop, secure internet connection, and registering to vote that way. It's very easy in this day of age to register to vote, but the work comes in regards to making sure that you do your own research, making sure that you vote for the individual that represents you and what you want. And that is something that you should not double think about.
We have something we want to give you too.
Oh.
So, the end of Give Us the Ballot,
Give us the ballot.
he says, keep going today, keep moving amid every obstacle, keep moving amid every mountain of opposition. If you will do that with dignity, when the history books are written in the future, the historians will have to look back and say, there lived a great people. So what we did is we printed out the entire speech
Thank you.
of Give Us the Ballot, and we wanted to give it to you.
Thank you very much. I do
Yes.
appreciate it.
Yes.
I think your brother, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, would be very proud of you today. You have taken the legacy, you have enriched your life with it, and you are sharing and giving back to others. Thank you so very much, Razan King and Mahad Omar. You gentlemen are true alpha men.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.